Hello, everyone, from joining us for this session on critical infrastructure network attacks, and specifically the attacks that we saw when we performed a utility or industrial control system oriented honeypot research. My name is Israel Barak. I'm the CISO at Cybereason. So, without further ado, let's kick this off. Now, looking at the honeypot research goals, our primary goals were really to expand our tracking, right, of changes in the adversarial landscape, the tools, the techniques, the practices that threat actors are using from a threat intel perspective. And really, we wanted to add threat intel context and analytics context around the telemetry that we often collect from both IT and OT environment. Now, to help accomplish that, this specific honeypot research was built to emulate an electric transmission substation network, and we basically used the network identifiers, both internal and external network identifiers, that are very similar to a known large electricity provider to entice attackers to show interest and maybe even target this honeypot. Now, looking at the outcomes so far from this research, I think the specter of cyber attacks against utility providers and the interest in protecting them come as the profile of adversaries who target industrial control system providers is really broadening. And I think while usually industrial control system attacks are linked to APT or advanced persistent threat actor groups and nation state threat actors, and those are probably still, the primary profile of an adversary that would target these environments, we were able to make that assessment, I think, today, based on honeypot data that we collected that really shows that the profile of threat actors that target these utility environments, these industrial control system environments, is broadening. And we're seeing many more types of threat actors getting into that mix and many more tiers of threat actors getting into that mix. Now, before we dive into the honeypot research results, I'd like to set some context on some key trends in the ransomware space that we're is going to be, and those are going to be important for us to understand, to put in context what we saw in the honeypot research. And I think those are going to be single stage ransomware and multi-stage ransomware operations. So ransomware has historically been used in the so-called shotgun approach, right? Basically, distributing the ransomware to as many targets as possible, and thereby increasing the chances of generating a revenue. Now, in these cases, the ransomware operator basically acquires a list of targets, many times in the form of a mailing list or an email address distribution list, and basically distributes that email to that entire distribution list. Now usually this is done with very little customization, usually just customizing the language to the geographic location of where that presumed target actually is. Those single stage ransomware attacks are usually very quick to detonate. Usually, when the target receives that outreach, the email or that link, and the ransomware lands on the endpoint of that target, it usually detonates on impact, or detonates very quickly. It starts encrypting the data and basically asks for money. Now, when you look at single stage ransomware, there usually is usually exists there usually are very few indicators of reuse, right? You see a large variety of strains in this space. A lot of new strains are being developed every month, and the idea is that those are fairly simple, rudimentary tools, fairly blunt tools, and so there's not a lot of need to reuse code from previous strains to actually get money out of these operations, and that actually makes it difficult to detect those with next generation AVs and static analysis tools. And those are single stage ransomware attacks. Can be fairly impactful, but usually when you think about business risk, those are actually the ones that pose lesser risk to corporate in larger enterprise organizations. Now, one of the critical trends in ransomware threats is the growth of a new operational paradigm, which is multi-stage ransomware. Now, those are essentially multi-stage hacking operations where the threat actor breaches a victim's network and performs several post-breach actions. And those actions are meant to result in a fairly large ransom payment. The general idea behind these operations is that a ransomware operator can generate significant revenue from a relatively small number of victims if each of them pays a large amount. When you think about all these ransomware cases that we've been seeing on the news that pay or at least extorted for six-figure sums, those are usually multi-stage ransomware attack. Now, in a multi-stage attack, the attack itself typically involves data theft, stealing user credentials, laterally moving through the victim network, and compromising other endpoints, and basically targeting critical assets like domain controllers and others in the network. Now, this operational attack pattern attempts to impact the victim in several different ways, including confidential data loss, sensitive user credential theft, disabling large amounts of systems to effectively cause a large-scale service disruption. And I think the idea behind these attacks is really to create, or behind the operational pattern of multi-stage ransomware attacks, is to create as many leverage points that the attacker can take advantage of to facilitate a large extortion. Now, ransomware attacks, both single stage and multi stage, are very prevalent, as we know, in IT environments. In fact, some threat actors have turned ransomware operations into the primary area of focus and source of revenue for them. But ransomware threat actors that target industrial control systems or critical infrastructure environments are presumed to be much less prevalent. Usually when you go through threat intelligence reports, those are usually presumed to be much less prevalent. And while at the onset of this ICS honeypot, we actually did not expect to encounter one, we ended up realizing that these attacks uh, can very likely be a lot more frequent than we might be used to thinking. Now, before we dive into the honeypot research results, this is a quick overview of the architecture of the honeypot that we had set up. Basically, the honeypot network was built to resemble an electric transmission substation. Right. The network architecture is very typical to a large substation. It contains several different elements here. Right. There's a DMZ area that is facing the external world, in this case the internet or the WAN environment. Some of the critical services here in the DMZ include typical services that you would find in a substation network, like remote technician interfaces. So if the station is currently in an unmanned situation, a technician would be able to connect remotely and support different types of issues, or analyze different types of issues, or if remote support is needed by an escalation point, and those personnel are able to connect remotely. We'll see that component in the network actually played a critical role in the incident that we're going to talk about here, serving as an initial access point for the attacker. Um, Other components here in the environment include the industrial control system network itself. In this case, you can see here the devices. Those are the different types of ICS controllers that we had here in the honeypot. ICS services segment in the network was focused on HMI systems that are based on OpenSCADA, and other service segments here in the network that are fairly typical to a large substation. Looking further into what we had here in the environment, the endpoints themselves were typically Windows or Linux based. The way we collected telemetry from the endpoints here and from the ICS environment was using the Cybereason sensor that's basically deployed on these endpoints and collecting the system user application behaviors on these endpoints that we were able to centrally correlate and analyze to identify potential attack patterns and provide visibility into them. Can also see that the network segmentation was fairly typical to an IT OT combined environment where the IT areas of the system are fairly reasonably segregated via various firewalls, in this case, from the IT network itself. Now, one of the primary incidents that occurred in this honeypot is what we believe to be a multi-stage ransomware attack, likely by a cybercrime threat actor. Now, at a glance, and we'll take a look shortly into the steps of the attack in more details through screenshots from the environment. The timeline of the attack started essentially 2 days right after we've connected the honeypot environment into the internet. So basically, at time equals 0, the network was ready. We had it connected to the internet, and it took us 2 days to get to the initial compromise of the environment. Now, in the initial compromise, what we can see here is the primary techniques that were used by the attacker. The initial access was through the remote technician interface. They basically brute forced user account credentials, and were able to gain access with those brute forced credentials into the RDP system. They then ran a series of discovery techniques, performing discovery on the Active Directory and the domain, as well as the DNS server that was in there, primarily doing reverse DNS lookups to identify where they are and what assets are in that network. And persistence was done in a fairly rudimentary way in this initial phase, using local user creation, basically creation of a backup user. The idea was that if we would go and change back or replace the passwords that they were able to brute force, they would still have a way to log in, right, and get back into the environment. Now, that was 2 days after we got this environment connected to the internet. The short amount of time is very likely indicative of some sort of automatic scanning activity that's going on that allowed the threat group here to identify the new asset that was connected and perform these actions very likely automatically on the remote technician interface. Now, 4 days after this, so 2 days after the first access, the threat actor access into the environment, we started noticing a different set of TTPs. We believe, by the way, that the change of TTPs that we're seeing between step 2 and 3 are very likely due to a handoff of this environment between two different threat actors. Very likely a first one that only got access to the environment and then sold it over to a second threat actor that continued to work on target, probably based on the attractiveness of the indicators of which network they believe that they compromised. Now, in step 3, basically the threat actor here started operating in a mode that was very focused on moving in the environment towards a higher goal. Right? And what we saw here is a operational pattern that's actually very common to multi-stage ransomware attacks. The first stage is to steal credentials, basically steal the passwords of every user that logged on to the machine, in this case, the remote technician access machines, and the tool that they used was Mimikatz. And then the second stage is to basically collect and exfiltrate all the data files that exist on that machine. The third stage was to drop a ransomware onto that machine. So at this point, the threat actor isn't detonating the ransomware. They're placing the ransomware on the machine, but they're not yet detonating it. Right? The idea is to wait until a later moment in time until they actually detonate this. Very, very similar to a pattern that exists in the multi-stage ransomware attacks. And then finally, the idea is to use all these stolen credentials from this machine to move laterally to other machines in this environment. In this case, they chose to use SMB and specifically PSExec to move in the environment. Now, this stage took some time, right? It took them several days to move throughout the environment. In this case, they're still in the IT environment, right? They're not yet in the OT. They're moving around the IT environment. 23 days after we started, that was 19 days after the previous step, the attacker exhibited a behavior that actually came as a surprise to us, right? What we expected them to do is to spread through the IT environment and then detonate the ransomware in the IT environment. Instead of that, they waited. They kept moving laterally in the environment. And then on day 23, for the honeypot, they made a lateral movement from the IT environment into the OT environment. And what they used to accomplish that, since the environments were separated, in this case with firewalls, they used a web service vulnerability that existed in our OpenSCADA HMI. And that surprised us because what that showed us is that the attacker came in with a playbook that they were able to execute on for pivoting between an IT and an OT environment, right? What they showed us was obviously the majority of the environment did not have access into the HMI or to the ICS services environment. Only specific services in the IT environment had that type of access. And what the threat actor showed us was that they were able to move laterally and they kept moving in the environment, in this case for 19 days, until they found a service that had the ability to access the HMI system, in this case to see the HMI data. And then what they did with that level of access is to pivot into the OT network by exploiting a web service vulnerability in our HMI system. So that was a surprise. From the moment they gained access into the OT environment, they started going through the same multi-stage ransomware operational pattern, changing techniques and procedures a little bit. In this case, since the environment was Linux-based, the credential access was done via pass the hash, pass the ticket technique, and the lateral movement was again via SMB, not PSExec in this environment, but SMB using pass the ticket technique. But the procedure for multi-stage attack, ransomware attack, was very similar. With each new host that they got access to, a ransomware was dropped, not detonated, but dropped, this time in the OT environment. Data was collected and exfiltrated over the command and control channel, and the stolen credentials were used to keep moving in the environment. And then later on day 24, the environment itself, the OT environment, was not very big, so they completed that portion of their pattern of laterally moving in that environment on day 24. And when they completed or they exhausted their ability to move laterally in the environment, late on day 24, they detonated the ransomware across both the IT and the OT environment simultaneously, basically encrypting all the data that was there and leading to system shutdowns right across the entire environment, and then demanding their ransom. Now, if we look at EDR data from this attack, and I'm using screenshots taken from the Cybereason EDR console, we can see the attack here starting with the attacker compromising a remote technician RDP service by basically brute forcing the local administrator password, then using PowerShell, right, to deploy the first stage of the attack, and among other things, initiate data theft from this compromised system and start performing persistence by creating a new local admin account. In the next stage, they actually, we can actually see in more details, right? The creation of the malicious local admin account that is used as backup, right? In case someone would reset the passwords for one of the users that they originally brute force. Their next step was to start downloading and staging additional tools, and specifically the ransomware drop. We can see that they're using PowerShell in this case to perform the file download, right, or dropping of those initial tools or additional tools on the endpoint, where one of these tools was the ransomware. Right? At this point, they're still not detonating the ransomware. They're placing it in a temporary folder on each of the hosts that they gain access to, but they're still not detonating it, right? The idea is, again, to wait until the cycle for lateral movement, data theft, credential theft, maximum leverage, right, has been achieved on the target, and then detonate, right, across the environment as a whole. The next step was performing a and network discovery. We can see that they're actually using a commodity network discovery tool here as part of their arsenal of tools, which I think is probably more indicative of a cybercrime threat actor than it is of a more sophisticated APT group. And I think we'll see that pattern repeating itself. We saw it in the network discovery. We saw it in that strain of ransomware that was used, a fairly commodity strain of ransomware, and we'll see it in a couple of other places. I think it's probably more indicative of a cyber crime threat actors in this particular space. Um, but what they're doing with this network discovery is first and foremost looking for assets that are critical for the network, like domain controllers, file servers, databases, right? To scan and discover first before discovering other endpoints in the network. The attacker is then stealing user credentials from the compromised asset. And basically, as you can see, they're using Mimikatz, right, to dump credentials from this compromised assets, and then they're using these stolen credentials in combination with legitimate administrative tools, as you can see here with PsExec, to move into other assets in the environment, right? So they're taking encryption keys from LSS, they're taking credentials and user passwords from this machine, the legitimate users, remote technicians in this particular case, and they're using these credentials as well as a legitimate administrative tool, PsExec, to move in the environment. Now, the first spread points that they're going after are actually the assets that will pose probably the least amount of suspicion, but likely cause the highest amount of impact to the organization, like domain controllers, file servers, and database servers that these compromised endpoints usually access as part of their normal day-to-day activity. And again, I think it's the use of commodity tool in this case for credential dumping and for lateral movement. I think is probably another indicator here for a cybercrime actor that very likely prefers speed and simplicity more than stealth and operational security. Now, they will continue to steal data and user credentials iteratively right through this environment using these techniques that we saw here, basically until they've exhausted their ability to move laterally, and only after they've completed that first stage, which in this case, in this honeypots environment, took several days, closer to 3 weeks for them to go through the IT and then make the pivot into OT and then cycle through the OT environment. Only after they've completed that first stage will they actually detonate that ransomware, and they will do it simultaneously. And that ransomware that we saw them dropping at a very early stage in the attack across all those compromised endpoints. Now, what this results in many cases, is a significant disruption to the victim's business, and obviously a significant risk of operational risk and risk of data loss. Now, when the extent of the disruption is large enough, and obviously unless an organization has full isolated DR capabilities that they can quickly revert to, even recovering from backups may not be a good enough option because of the amount of time a large scale recovery can take. And that leads organizations and sometimes even insurers to start considering negotiating with the attacker. Now, looking at some of our takeaways from this honeypot, and we saw some of the mechanics of the attack, and we understood how attackers get to the point where they can leverage the attack to try to extort large amounts of money. And we also saw the element that at least us, we found surprising, was that playbook for pivoting from IT to OT, which was very surprising for us to see in a cybercrime actor. For us, some of the key takeaways from this research are, first and foremost, the diversity of threat actors that are actually targeting utility providers and ICS systems. I think judging by how quickly these attackers operated and their ability to pivot from the IT environment to the OT environment, I think while we can conclude that this is likely a cybercrime group, they're still very familiar with ICS environment, the security measures that utility providers implement, and how to move from an IT environment to an OT environment. And I think what this suggests that this honeypot wasn't the first time that they've done this, and they've probably been implementing this playbook fairly often. The other thing is, I think that the fact that multiple tiers of attackers find ICS environments interesting very, very likely means increased risk for people who operate these type of systems. I think the security basics are really what's going to prevent a bad day from becoming a catastrophic day. Right, in these environments, I think, when you think about these environments in most utility providers, not all of them, but I would say most environments, these systems are old, they're fragile, and even trained hacking units make mistakes that cause failures in these controls. And hackers seeking to make a name for themselves or simply prove that they can get into a system, I think, are far more likely to cause failures out of ignorance rather than malice. And I think this makes instant response and attribution harder, but I think it also is more likely to result in an unintended real world effect. Now, second, I think it's important that companies with ICS environments operate a unified SOC that provides visibility into the IT and OT environment. Right. I think as we saw in the honeypot research, attackers are looking to use IT environments as gateways into OT environments. I think we need to have an ability to correlate activities that are starting in the IT environment or starting in the OT environment and traverse, right, that bridge between those environments, so we can have a better understanding of how to respond to them and the nature of the risk that they present. I think often companies have a NOC monitoring the OT environment, but a combined SOC lets you see all operations as they move through the network. And I think having that visibility is important because attackers, as we see here, could very likely start in the IT environment and move to the OT environment. And lastly, I think threat hunting is critical. This activity looks for indicators that attackers are already in the company's environment. Instead of waiting to react to an alert issued by a security tool, I think threat hunting allows defenders to take a proactive approach to security by detecting adversaries before they cause severe damage to a network. And I think establishing endpoint visibility, having behavioral detection capabilities are going to be critical for effective threat hunting, let alone for scoping and responding to those incidents. And with that, first and foremost, I would like to thank you for joining us on this session and open this session up for any questions.